Nick Clegg, welcome to High School of International Relations. It's an honor to have you here. My first question is related to the referendum for the Scottish independence. What was the meaning of this referendum?
Well, the meaning, of course, was that the increasing success of the Scottish National Party and the increasing popularity of Scottish nationalism and the increasingly large number of people who said that they wanted to see an independent Scotland led to a victory by the SNP in the elections to the Scottish Parliament on an explicit mandate to hold a referendum on independence. And so the response in central government at the time that I was a Deputy Prime Minister was to say, well, you know, we recognise that the SNP had the mandate to hold a referendum, the democratic mandate, and we then set about to actually, even though we were passionately, including myself, were passionately against the idea of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, we worked, you know, pretty diligently really to make sure that the referendum was held in a proper, orderly and legal way. But the genesis of it was the political success of Scottish nationalism and a recognition in Westminster and Whitehall that this entitled the new Scottish government to hold a referendum and that we should facilitate the holding of the referendum, even though we would then, of course, argue the opposite case on the actual question in the referendum.
Mm-hmm. And has this referendum had any impact in British politics so far?
It's had a very dramatic impact. Firstly, it hasn't settled the issue. So anyone who says that a referendum will settle an issue for a generation, I'm afraid it doesn't appear to be the case. I wish it did. I think it should. I think, you know, the SNP have spent decades dreaming of this moment to hold a referendum, but because it was closer than some people may have predicted some years ago, they're already very quickly reversing their declarations at the time that another referendum would not be held soon, by now inventing various excuses about why another referendum should be held soon. So that's the first big effect, is it hasn't actually settled the issue which was at stake in the referendum. But perhaps even more surprisingly, or at least no one predicted it, is that what you've really now got in British politics is a sort of seesaw between Scottish nationalism north of the border and English conservatism south of the border. And that's actually now the big axis which is driving British politics. So Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the SNP, spends all her time telling the people of Scotland why they should fear English conservatives, and David Cameron spends all his time telling English voters why they should fear Scottish nationalists. So they've become very convenient. Sort of, bogey figures for each other, and it means that this last general election, in many ways, it was the tail of Scottish nationalism that wagged the British dog, because certainly in the latter stages of the election, the reason why more people voted in the last stages of the election campaign for the Conservatives was as a direct result of the fear that that the Scottish nationalists would start dictating terms to a possible minority Labour government. So I think it's not only if you like reinvigorated rather than settled the referendum issue, the independence issue. It's also changed very significantly the kind of basic ebb and flow of British politics.
Does the rise of Jeremy Corbyn has anything to do with this?
Yes, it does in part. It's partly a response to the fact that the Labour Party was demolished by the SNP north of the border, so they've decided that the best way to, or they appear to have decided, you'll need to ask a Labour politician, but they appear to have decided that the best way to, make a comeback in Scotland is to try and sort of outflank the SNP from the left. Personally, I think that's a big mistake, but there you go. That's their calculation, and partly because partly because of a perhaps more understandable feeling that sort of business as usual won't help the Labour Party, and that they need to do something sort of radically different to try and break this pendulum of Scottish nationalism and English conservatism. I don't think the way they're going about it is the right way to do it, but I can understand that's why they're lurching about. The Labour Party's completely lost its identity, and so, like all political parties that lose their identity, they're now casting around to find a new one.
And why is liberalism in retreat in Europe nowadays? How do you explain that?
Well, liberalism isn't very well suited to a sort of climate of fear and insecurity, which is very profound at the moment. Liberalism's, tends to thrive politically when people are feeling more secure about their own well-being, because then people feel they've got more time to think about others, to think about new things, to risk reform. We're living in a time where people are retreating to certainties in the face of great uncertainty. And liberalism is actually a philosophy which embraces change, innovation, even embraces uncertainty and experimentation. We're not a sort of safety-first option generally. And what people want at the moment is safety first, which is why conservatism is doing well, because that's a traditional safety-first response, as is nationalism, because nationalism is all about providing people with a, in my view, false but nonetheless compelling sort of comfort blanket. Liberalism doesn't provide a sort of comfort blanket in politics. So we're either just going to have to wait until the wheel turns, or better still, come up with a way of trying to, provide a more compelling liberal answer to the insecurities that are driving people in different directions.
Why will the UK hold a referendum to ask their citizens whether they want to stay or leave the European Union?
Well, the most immediate reason is because of David Cameron's weakness within his own parliamentary party. So it's basic, referenda, certainly in a place like Britain, are almost always held. It was the same case for Harold Wilson in the 1970s. Almost always held as a consequence of political weakness. And because the Conservative Party has become increasingly divided, large parts of it have become increasingly isolationist and increasingly indistinguishable from the UK Independence Party. In other words, they want the UK to leave the European Union. The way in which David Cameron has sought to resolve his internal party difficulties is by asking the rest of us to resolve it for him. Well, that's the reason. Mm-hmm. But whatever the reason, we need to win it. Pro-Europeans need to win it now. But that's the immediate reason. Because if you read newspapers and say, "Oh, it's the most important issue," it's not actually what most normal people think is the most. They care much more about the NHS or immigration or jobs or crime. I suspect there's a small bunch of people who care passionately about being in Europe, and then there's probably a slightly larger group, but still minority group of people who care passionately about leaving. My guess is the vast majority of British people don't care that much, which is why it's possibly going to be more unpredictable than people imagine. Because if you ask millions of your fellow citizens a question which has huge economic and social and constitutional implications, when they themselves don't give a damn, it's very, very difficult to be scientific about, what the outcome is going to be.
What should be reformed in the European Union, in your view? What's the most urgent reform?
It needs to be reformed all the time. One of the things that the anti-Europeans have very cleverly managed to do in recent years is somehow suggest that if you are in favour of Britain's membership of the European Union, you're against reform. It's ludicrous. It's a bit like saying if you're, if you believe in democracy, you're against Westminster, or it's just such a sort of. But that's they've successfully done that. So I remember in the years that I worked in the European Union, I probably got my hands dirty more in pushing for and succeeding in delivering reform than the most battle-hardened Eurosceptic. Of course, there's things to be reformed from. Stuff that is just silly, like the European Parliament moving from one country to the next, through to the deficiencies of the common agricultural policy, through to unnecessary or occasionally unnecessary directives, through to the imbalances in the Eurozone. I mean, there's huge numbers of things that need to be reformed. I suspect right now the reforms that are most important of all is firstly reforms which will stabilise the Eurozone. Nothing is possible if you don't have a prosperous, stable monetary union within the European Union. And secondly, a compelling collective answer to this unprecedented migration issue. So I would start with those reforms. I think they are now much more important than the traditional shopping list which are all very worthy things, of changing the common agricultural policy, introducing more competitiveness. All of those things are true. But I think right now, the reforms that are needed are the reforms to deal with the big crises that we have, looming over the European Union.
Clegg, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.